Welcome back to the front lines. I'm Harper Vance. On this channel, we tell the stories of those who served and the battles they fight long after the uniform comes off. Today, we're deploying into the life of U.S. Army Sergeant Ellie Cole. She survived IEDs in the dust of Afghanistan, but nothing could prepare her for the enemy waiting at home. While Ellie stood alone at her 3-year-old daughter's grave, her own family was popping champagne at a housewarming party funded by fraud. But they made a fatal calculation. They thought they were ignoring a grieving mother. They didn't realize they had just engaged a combat veteran who knows exactly how to dismantle a target, piece by piece. Lock and load. Here is Sergeant Cole's final mission. The sterile air of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center always felt like a heavy, invisible weight pressing against my chest. But today, it was suffocating. It carried the sharp, biting scent of antiseptic and the hollow stillness of a place where time stood still while the world outside kept turning. I sat in a cramped plastic chair that had become my entire universe, my eyes fixed on Grace. My beautiful 3-year-old daughter looked so small, lost amidst a sea of white linens and a labyrinth of clear plastic tubing. The heart monitor was the only thing breaking the silence, emitting a rhythmic, haunting chirp that echoed the fragile state of her life. It was a slow, steady pulse that felt like the ticking of a clock I couldn't stop. I was Sergeant Ellie Cole, a woman who had seen the worst of the world in the dust of Afghanistan. I had stood my ground against IEDs without blinking, yet here, in the quiet of a pediatric oncology ward, my hands were shaking as I cradled Grace's tiny, cold fingers. Her skin felt like parchment, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged whistle that tore at my soul. Dr. Peterson had stood where I was standing just an hour ago, his face a mask of practiced empathy as he delivered a sentence that felt like a firing squad. He told me we were down to days, not weeks, and that I should prepare myself. I smoothed a few stray strands of hair from her forehead, the remnants of a life before chemo, and I forced myself to swallow the scream rising in my throat. As a soldier, you learn that you don't break down while your comrade is still in the fight, and my little girl was fighting with everything she had left. The silence was shattered by the sharp metallic vibration of my phone inside my cargo pocket. It wasn't just one buzz, but a relentless, frantic barrage of notifications that felt like a physical assault. 17 times the motor whirred against my leg, demanding my attention with an urgency that usually meant a red alert or a change in orders. For a fleeting, desperate second, I hoped it was my sister Vanessa calling to ask about Grace, to offer a word of comfort, or even just to say she was thinking of us. I pulled the device out, and the screen lit up, but there were no prayers, no questions about white blood cell counts or oxygen levels. Instead, the screen was flooded with high-resolution images of fabric swatches. Vanessa had sent me a gallery of tablecloths, her messages popping up one after another in a dizzying stream of vanity. She was asking me if ivory or vanilla cream looked more sophisticated for her upcoming housewarming party. She was agonizing over the aesthetic of a table while I was watching my child's life flicker out like a candle in a draft. There was a 2-minute voice note at the end of the chain, and I found myself standing up, my legs leaden, as I stepped out into the hallway to listen. Vanessa's voice came through the speaker, chirping with a forced, high-pitched energy that sounded like glass breaking. She told me she had officially set the date for June 15th for the grand reveal of her dream home. She talked about our parents flying in from Phoenix and how I absolutely had to be there. She told me to stop using Grace's illness as an excuse to hide away and said I needed her positive vibes to wash away all the gloom I was carrying around. The heat rose in my neck, a slow burn of fury that made my vision blur at the edges. My grip on the phone was so tight that my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the plastic casing creaking under the pressure. I hit the call back button, my voice coming out as a jagged, low rasp that felt foreign even to me. I told her plainly that Grace was dying. I told her the doctors didn't think she would make it through the week and that June 15th wouldn't be a day for a party. It would likely be the day I had to lower my daughter into the ground. I waited for the silence on the other end, expecting the shock to finally break through her bubble of self-obsession. But the silence that followed wasn't born of grief or realization. It was the calculated silence of someone who felt inconvenienced. I heard her let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind she used when a waiter got her order wrong. She told me I was being dramatic again, accusing me of sabotaging her happiness right when she was at the finish line. She reminded me how hard she had worked for that 5-bedroom house and how the deposits were already paid and the invitations were already out. She told me that Grace would be fine, or maybe she wouldn't, but that life had to go on regardless. She spoke as if my daughter's death was a minor scheduling conflict in her carefully curated life. "I won't cancel the party," Vanessa said, her tone shifting into something cold and final, like a judge delivering a verdict from a high bench. She told me our parents had already bought their non-refundable tickets and that I needed to figure it out on my own. She said that if Grace passed away, it would be sad, of course, but that I shouldn't let it ruin her big day. Then she twisted the knife, asking if I was just jealous of her success and trying to steal the spotlight. I stood there, frozen in the middle of that sterile, brightly lit hallway, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the distant murmur of nurses. The greatest betrayal didn't come from an enemy on the battlefield. It came from the very blood that ran through my veins. To Vanessa, her niece's final moments weren't a tragedy. They were a nuisance, a stain on the perfect image she wanted to project to the world. I ended the call without another word, the silence of the phone feeling like a vacuum. I felt like I had just taken a bullet to the heart, a clean shot that went straight through my armor and left me bleeding out in the dark. I walked back into the room and sat down by Grace, the sound of the heart monitor now feeling like a countdown. I realized then that I was truly alone in this fight, and that the family I thought I had was nothing more than a collection of strangers who shared my last name, but none of my soul. I leaned over and kissed Grace's forehead, whispering to her that it was just the two of us now, and that was all we ever really needed. The hum of the refrigerator in my small apartment near the base felt louder than usual tonight, a monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid medical bills and the flickering screen of my laptop, but my mind was miles away, anchored in the past by the ghost of a conversation I'd had just hours ago. Vanessa's voice, sharp and entitled, kept echoing in my head, specifically that casual mention of the non-refundable tickets our parents had already purchased for her housewarming party. It was funny in a twisted sort of way how a single phrase about a plane ticket could act like a key, unlocking a vault of memories I had tried so hard to keep buried under my uniform and my duty. I found myself back in the sweltering heat of a June afternoon over a decade ago, the day of our high school graduation. Vanessa had finished with a mediocre GPA, her 4 years spent more on social climbing than studying. Yet she stood there in her cap and gown, looking like the queen of the world. Our parents, Harold and Janet, were beaming, practically vibrating with pride as they handed her 2 life-altering gifts: the keys to a brand-new red convertible and a signed check covering 4 years of tuition at an elite, private university out of state. When it was my turn, I, the straight A student and the one who had actually earned a scholarship that covered only half my costs, received a firm pat on the back from my father. He looked me in the eye and said that I was the strong one, that I was the resilient daughter who knew how to handle herself, and because of that, they had decided to put all their remaining savings into Vanessa's future because she needed the extra help to succeed. I didn't argue then, and I didn't cry. I simply did what I had always done. I figured it out. 2 weeks later, I sat in a recruitment office and signed away my 20s to the United States Army. It wasn't about patriotism then, though that came later. It was about the GI Bill and the desperate need to build a life where I didn't have to beg for the scraps of my parents' affection. While Vanessa was posting photos of sorority mixers and beach trips, I was face down in the mud at Fort Benning, my lungs screaming for air and my fingers bleeding from the grit of the obstacle course. I traded my safety and my youth for a chance at an education that my sister had been handed on a silver platter. The pattern of being the invisible daughter only solidified as the years went by. I remember standing on the parade deck for my basic training graduation, my uniform pressed so sharply it felt like it could cut glass. Thousands of parents were in the stands, cheering and waving American flags. But as I scanned the crowd, the 2 faces I hungered for were nowhere to be found. My phone buzzed in my pocket afterward with a text from my mother. She said she was so sorry they couldn't make it, but Vanessa's long-term boyfriend had just broken up with her, and the poor girl was such a wreck that they couldn't possibly leave her alone in such a state. My accomplishment, the grueling months of transformation from a girl to a soldier, was nothing compared to the temporary heartbreak of the golden child. Even years later, when I was lying in a hospital bed with a Purple Heart on my nightstand after an IED blast in Afghanistan, my father didn't ask about the shrapnel or the nightmares. His first question on the phone was whether my military insurance covered everything, because they were currently helping Vanessa with a down payment on her first condo and couldn't afford any unexpected family expenses. The double standard eventually trickled down to the next generation, and that was where the pain became unbearable. A few years ago, Vanessa adopted a miniature poodle she named Princess. My parents treated that dog like royalty, sending monthly care packages filled with organic treats and designer sweaters. When Princess had a minor stomach issue, my mother flew from Phoenix to Virginia just to sit with the dog for 3 days so Vanessa wouldn't feel stressed. Yet, when my Grace was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma, the response was a sterile get-well-soon card from Walmart with a $2 bill tucked inside for a treat. My mother called me once to suggest that perhaps Grace's illness was due to the stress of my military lifestyle or the diet I provided. A subtle jab that implied my daughter's fight for life was somehow my fault. They never once visited the pediatric ward at Walter Reed, claiming the smell of hospitals made them uneasy and that cross-country flights were simply too expensive during the holiday season. Now, back in my silent kitchen, I looked at my bank balance again. I had sold my old SUV, taken out every loan available to me, and was living on canned soup just to ensure Grace had the best comfort care possible. Meanwhile, my parents were happily spending thousands on business class tickets to celebrate Vanessa's million-dollar home. A home built on the foundation of the favoritism that had defined our lives. I realized then that in the emotional ledgers of the Cole family, my account and Grace's had always been marked with a 0. It wasn't that they lacked the resources to care, it was that they simply didn't find us worthy of the investment. The realization was a cold, hard stone in my stomach, more painful than any wound I had carried home from the war. I closed my laptop and walked toward the bedroom, the weight of the past finally making me realize that the only family I truly had was the small, brave girl waiting for me in that hospital bed. As I was writing this part of Ellie's journey, my heart honestly broke for her. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the one who always shows up, only to realize that the people you're showing up for would never do the same for you. It's a pain that many of us carry in silence, isn't it? If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, or if Ellie's strength moved you today, please leave a like and comment the word heart below. Your support means the world to me and helps tell stories that deserve to be heard. Let's stand with Ellie together. At 4:12 a.m. on June 9th, the world outside Walter Reed was wrapped in a heavy, indifferent blanket of darkness. But inside that small room, the very fabric of my existence was being torn apart. The air felt stagnant, thick with the lingering scent of antiseptic and the ghostly remains of a life that was slipping away second by second. Grace's breathing, which had been a ragged, desperate struggle for hours, suddenly smoothed out into something light and airy, as if she were finally letting go of a weight too heavy for a 3-year-old to carry. Then came the sound that will haunt my dreams until the day I join her. The long, unwavering eye of the heart monitor, a flat line that signaled the end of our war. I didn't scream or collapse into the hysterics the movies always show. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me, the kind of numbness that settles in when you've seen too much on the front lines. I stood up from that plastic chair, my joints creaking, and leaned over to press one last kiss against her forehead. Her skin was still warm, but the light that made her, Grace, was gone. I whispered into her ear that her mission was complete, that she was safe now and didn't have to fight anymore. In the dim light of the ward, I stood at attention and gave her a slow, crisp salute, a soldier's final respect to the bravest warrior I had ever served with. She had been liberated from the pain, but I was left standing in the ruins of my heart, a lone sentry in a landscape of grief. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, mocking shadows across the hospital parking lot as I finally found the strength to pull my phone from my pocket. My fingers were numb as I dialed my father's number, my mind replaying the Bible verses I had read to Grace in her final hours, particularly the one about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. I realized then that I was still in that valley, and I was utterly alone. The phone rang for a long time, the rhythmic chirping feeling like a drill against my temple, until finally, I heard the click of a connection. The background noise was jarringly different from the silence of the pediatric ward. I could hear the sharp whir of the wind and the unmistakable clean clack of a golf club striking a ball. My father's voice came through, sounding breathless and annoyingly cheerful, as he told someone in the distance that it was a great shot. When he finally spoke to me, his tone was one of mild inconvenience, as if I were calling to complain about a late package. I told him as clearly as I could that Grace was gone. There was a pause, but no gasp of horror, no sob of heartbreak. He simply let out a small, measured sigh and said it was a pity. But at least she wasn't in pain anymore. He spoke about my daughter's death with the same casual detachment one might use to discuss a forecast for rain. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay grounded as the fury began to simmer beneath my skin. I told him that the funeral home had scheduled the service for June 15th and that I needed them there, that I couldn't do this by myself. The silence on the other end grew heavy, and I could hear him shifting his weight, likely preparing for his next swing. He told me that June 15th was a difficult day, reminding me that their flight was already booked directly to the city where Vanessa lived. He explained that changing the tickets would cost them over $1,000 in fees, and since their retirement funds were tight, they simply couldn't justify the expense. Then he dropped the words that shattered the last remaining pillar of my faith in our bloodline. He suggested that maybe I could talk to the funeral home about keeping Grace in the cold room for a few extra days. He said it wasn't like she would know the difference anyway, and it would allow them to attend Vanessa's housewarming party first and then fly over to me the following week. He spoke about my daughter's body as if it were a piece of luggage that could be left in a locker until it was convenient for him to pick it up. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to lean against the cold brick wall of the hospital. In that moment, the man on the other end of the line ceased to be my father. He became a stranger. A person so hollowed out by vanity and favoritism that there was no room left for basic human decency. I realized that for my family, my grief was nothing more than a logistical hurdle that threatened to dampen Vanessa's big reveal. They were choosing a barbecue and a new house over the burial of their own grandchild. I felt a cold, hard shield snap into place around my soul, the same one I used when things went south in the desert. I didn't cry again. The tears had been burned away by a white-hot contempt that felt cleaner and more honest. My voice was as steady and sharp as a bayonet as I told him to listen very carefully. I told him not to come, not then, and not ever again. I told him to go enjoy his party and his steaks, and to never speak my name or my daughter's name as long as he lived. I hung up before he could offer another excuse, the silence that followed feeling like a liberation. I walked back toward the hospital entrance to sign the final papers, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. I was a mother who had lost her child and a daughter who had buried her parents while they were still breathing. But as I adjusted my posture, I knew I was still a soldier. I was the only one left to stand guard over Grace's memory, and I would do it with a strength they could never understand. The gray sky over the National Cemetery on June 15th felt like a heavy woolen blanket, soaked in tears. I stood there in my dress blues, the fabric stiff and formal against my skin, my metals catching the dull light like small, cold stars. Every crease was sharp, every brass button polished to a mirror shine, reflecting a loneliness that felt absolute. Just a few feet away, the first row of folding chairs sat in a perfectly straight line, their plastic frames gleaming under the overcast light. Each chair in that front row had a small white card taped to the back with the words, "Reserved for Family," printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. They were empty. Not a single person from the Cole bloodline sat there. No father to hold my hand, no mother to weep on my shoulder, no sister to offer even a fleeting word of hollow comfort. The wind whistled through the gaps between the seats, a hollow, mocking sound that amplified the silence of their betrayal. At that moment, their absence was louder than any eulogy could ever be. It was a screaming declaration that my 3-year-old daughter, a girl who had fought for every breath she ever took, wasn't worth the price of a plane ticket or the minor inconvenience of missing a housewarming party. Then the heavy silence was shattered by a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. It started as a faint vibration in my chest and grew into a thunderous roar as a column of motorcycles crested the hill. The Patriot Guard riders, a phalanx of chrome and leather, led by Julia, my former squad leader. She was the woman who had dragged me out of a burning Humvee in the middle of a dust storm in Kandahar. And today, she had driven 6 hours through the night from Virginia to pull me out of the wreckage of my own soul. Behind her was David, my ex-husband. We had been broken by the wars we brought home, our marriage a casualty of the things we couldn't unsee. But he was here. His eyes were rimmed with red, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a grief that matched my own. He didn't say a word as he stepped toward me, but the way he gripped my shoulder told me everything I needed to know. His hand was trembling, yet it was the only thing keeping me upright. Slowly, the empty chairs behind me began to fill, not with relatives, but with men and women in worn leather vests and faded uniforms. They were my chosen family, the ones who understood that loyalty isn't something you're born with, it's something you earn in the trenches. The ceremony began with a solemnity that only the military can command. The bugler stood at the edge of the trees, and as the first note of taps drifted into the air, the world seemed to stop breathing. Those 24 notes were a jagged blade, cutting through the numbness I'd cultivated like a shield. I stood at attention, my back as straight as a bayonet, my hand snapped to the brim of my cover in a final, agonizing salute. 2 honor guard members began the ritual of folding the flag over Grace's small casket. 13 folds, each one precise and heavy with meaning, performed with a reverence that brought a lump to my throat that I couldn't swallow. When the officer knelt before me, clutching the tight blue triangle of stars, his voice was a low, steady anchor in the storm. He told me that on behalf of the president and a grateful nation, this flag was presented as a token of appreciation for my daughter's brave fight. I took the flag into my arms, the fabric rough against my palms, and finally, the first hot tear escaped, carving a path through the stoicism I had worn like armor. Grace was being honored with the dignity of a fallen hero, while her own grandparents were likely 2,000 miles away, raising a glass of champagne to celebrate a new set of granite countertops. As the crowd dispersed and the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, only Julia remained by my side near the fresh mound of earth. She looked at the row of empty chairs, then turned and spat on the grass with a quiet, simmering fury. She didn't offer any platitudes about forgiveness or moving on. She simply looked me in the eye and told me that they would pay for leaving me to stand alone on a day like this. I reached down and touched the cold, smooth granite of the headstone that bore my daughter's name. The deep, hollow ache in my chest was still there, but it was being replaced by something else, something sharper and much more dangerous. The sadness was beginning to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. I whispered to Grace that I wouldn't forget, and I wouldn't let them forget either. My family had made their choice, opting for the comfort of a party over the sanctity of a burial. They had drawn a line in the sand, thinking I was too broken to cross it. But as I stood there clutching the flag of a nation that cared more for my child than her own kin did, I realized that the war wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. I was a soldier who had lost everything, and a person with nothing left to lose is the most formidable enemy of all. The silence in my apartment was heavy, a tomb-like stillness that felt more oppressive than the humid air of a combat zone. I didn't reach for the light switch as I walked through the door. Instead, I let the cold, blue glare of my laptop screen illuminate my face, a digital fire that offered no warmth. My training as a scout took over, that old military instinct to understand the terrain and the movements of the enemy before making a move. I needed to see what they were doing while I was burying my daughter. I logged into a secondary account, a ghost profile I used for work-related reconnaissance, and typed the name that felt like a slur in my mind. Vanessa Cole. Her profile was a nauseating explosion of color, saturated with high-definition filters and heart icons that felt like needles under my skin. Right at the top, pinned for the world to see, was a live stream recording titled Housewarming Party. Below the title, she had plastered the hashtags Blessed, New Beginnings, and Family is Everything. I hesitated for a second, my finger hovering over the play button. Then I clicked. The high-pitched, energetic beat of a Latin pop song erupted from the speakers, a jarring contrast to the ringing silence of my living room. I looked at the timestamp on the video. It started at exactly 10:30 a.m. That was the precise moment the honor guard began the 13 folds of the American flag over Grace's casket. While the bugler was playing taps and I was trying to find the strength to breathe, my sister was adjusting her camera lens to get the best lighting for her poolside reveal. In the video, Vanessa was wearing a tight, white designer dress that looked like a celebration of her own ego. She held a glass of sparkling champagne, her laugh loud and performative as she panned the camera around the backyard of her million-dollar home. I watched as the camera swung toward the grill, capturing my father, Harold. He was wearing a novelty apron, his face flushed red from the heat of the charcoal and the alcohol, flipping steaks with a wide, carefree grin. There was no black armband, no moment of silence, not even a slight slump in his posture to suggest he had a granddaughter being lowered into the earth 3 states away. Then came my mother, Janet. She was standing in a circle of Vanessa's friends, holding up her wrist to show off a new gold bracelet, her eyes sparkling with the kind of excitement she had never once shown for any of my military promotions or Grace's small victories. They were dancing. They were eating. They were celebrating a house while my world was being reduced to a 6-foot-deep hole in the ground. The most jagged piece of the betrayal came toward the middle of the stream. Vanessa turned the camera back to her own face, her eyes wide with that practiced, wide-eyed sincerity she used when she wanted to play the martyr. Someone off-camera asked a question about why her sister wasn't there to see the new place. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh and made a sad face for exactly 2 seconds before shrugging her shoulders. She told the viewers that Ellie had chosen to stay in the past, that I was stuck in a loop of negativity and that it was heartbreaking to watch. Then, with a voice full of a toxic kind of cheer, she declared that the family had to move on and focus on the beautiful future ahead of them. The crowd behind her cheered and raised their glasses, echoing her sentiment as if my grief were a personal failure rather than a human tragedy. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit me, and I barely made it to the bathroom before my stomach turned. I leaned over the sink, gasping for air, the taste of bile and bitterness coating my tongue. They hadn't just ignored me, they were using my daughter's death as a backdrop to highlight their own supposed resilience and strength. I was the negative one because I wouldn't leave my child's grave to eat a steak in her backyard. I looked up at the mirror, the harsh bathroom light reflecting off my eyes. They weren't wet with tears anymore. They were hard, glowing with a cold, focused fire that I hadn't felt since I was in the middle of a firefight. The Sergeant Cole who had spent years enduring and surviving was gone. The person staring back at me was someone who realized that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands with you when the world is burning. My family had chosen their side. They had treated the end of Grace's life as a minor inconvenience, a dark cloud they could simply step out of. I wiped my mouth and stood tall, my spine straightening as if I were back in formation. The time for silent endurance was over. They wanted a performance, and I was going to give them one they would never forget. It had been exactly 7 days since I watched the last of the red Virginia clay cover my daughter's casket, and the silence in my home had become a physical presence, a heavy, airless thing that sat in every corner. I was sitting at my small wooden kitchen table, the late afternoon sun cutting a sharp, indifferent line across the surface. My hands were busy with a familiar, grounding ritual. The field, stripping and cleaning of my personal sidearm. There was something meditative about the scent of gun oil and the cold, unyielding weight of the steel parts in my palms. It was a habit from my years in the service, a way to focus the mind when the world outside felt like it was spinning out of control. The rhythmic click and slide of the metal were the only sounds until my phone began to vibrate against the wood. the noise jarring and intrusive like a siren in a cathedral. I saw the name on the screen, Mom, and I felt a familiar, cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I didn't want to answer, but the sergeant in me knew that you never let an enemy movement go unobserved. I swiped the screen and set it on the table, clicking the speaker on without saying a word. There was no greeting, no gentle inquiry about how I was breathing, or if I had eaten a meal since the funeral. My mother's voice came through the speaker, sharp and high-pitched, carrying the unmistakable tone of a primary school teacher about to scold a troublesome child. She asked me if I was online and why I hadn't liked Vanessa's latest photo gallery of the new house yet. She told me that I was making my sister incredibly sad and that Vanessa was convinced I was ignoring her out of pure jealousy for her success. I stopped moving, a cleaning patch frozen in my hand, as I felt a dry, hollow laugh bubble up in my chest. I asked her if she was being serious, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. I asked her if, in the middle of burying my only child, she truly expected me to prioritize a social media notification for a house built on the favoritism that had defined our lives. My mother didn't even pause to acknowledge the weight of my words. She simply pushed forward with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime gaslighting everyone around her. She told me to stop being a drama queen and said that what happened with Grace was unfortunate, but it was over now. She said that Grace was gone, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, so why was I insisting on dragging everyone else down into my negativity? She told me that the living were the ones who mattered, and that Vanessa had just received a major promotion to go along with her new home. She said Vanessa was the pride of the family, and that the least I could do was offer a public word of congratulations to keep the peace. I felt the last lingering spark of hope for my family. The tiny, irrational part of me that still wanted a mother's love, flicker out and die right there on that kitchen table. I set the slide of the handgun down with a sharp, metallic clack that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. I told her she was right, that the living did indeed matter, and that I was very much alive. I asked her if she had even considered what I was doing while she was raising a glass of champagne in that video. I told her I was standing alone in a cemetery, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders while I waited for a miracle that never came. I told her I waited for my parents to show up, to prove that I was more than just an afterthought, but they had chosen the party and the golden child instead. The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy, the first sign that I had finally cracked the shell of her self-obsession. I didn't give her a chance to recover. I told her that if she wanted a celebration, I was going to give the entire family something they would never forget. I told her I would show her exactly what a person is capable of when they have been pushed into a corner and stripped of everything they love. I ended the call before she could offer another hollow excuse or a fresh layer of guilt. I didn't block her number yet. I wanted them to sit in the uncertainty of what I had just said, to let the fear of the unknown begin to erode their perfect, shiny world. My hands were steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. I picked up the phone again and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Trevor answered on the second ring, his voice sounding just as sharp and cynical as I remembered from our time together in the investigative unit. I asked him if he remembered the files I'd mentioned about the pharmaceutical firm Vanessa worked for, the ones involving the suppressed data on childhood medication. He said he did, and I told him it was time to move. I told him the fuse was lit, and I was ready to bring the whole house down. Speaking to you today as someone who has seen Ellie's journey unfold, I cannot help but feel a profound sense of pride in her strength. There comes a moment in every person's life where you have to decide if you will continue to let others define your worth or if you will stand up and claim it for yourself. Ellie has finally chosen herself, and while the path ahead is difficult, she's no longer walking it as a victim. If you have ever had to find the courage to speak your truth when the world tried to silence you, please leave a like and comment the word brave below. Your stories and your presence here remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. Let us support Ellie as she takes this final, necessary stand. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it had finally changed its state of matter. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating cloud that paralyzed my movements. It had condensed into something cold, sharp, and incredibly focused, much like the edge of a combat knife. My small apartment near the base had transformed into what we called a tactical operations center during my time in the service. The stacks of sympathy cards from strangers were pushed aside, replaced by folders of financial records and the steady blue hum of my dual monitors. I moved with a surgical purpose I hadn't felt since my last deployment, no longer acting as a grieving mother, but as a sergeant executing a reconnaissance mission against a target that had left its flank wide open. I opened my small personal safe and pulled out an old, unassuming USB drive that I had kept as a sort of insurance policy for years. During the long seasons when Vanessa had basked in her own perceived glory, she had a habit of treating me like her unrefined, flyover country sister who was too simple to understand the complexities of her high-flying corporate world. She loved to brag about her aggressive sales tactics during our infrequent holiday calls, thinking I was merely a captive audience for her ego. She once laughed over drinks about how a pair of VIP concert tickets and a few expensive steak dinners could convince a rural doctor to prescribe OxyContin to an entire town of unsuspecting people. She thought she was sharing success stories of her prowess as a pharmaceutical rep. I knew she was documenting federal bribery and the systemic fueling of the opioid crisis. I began the painstaking process of combing through years of saved emails, old text messages, and photos of five-star restaurant receipts she had sent to show off her lifestyle. Every single one was a digital breadcrumb leading to a massive kickback scheme. I wasn't just gathering information anymore. I was assembling a dossier that would ensure her house of cards collapsed with absolute precision. I met Trevor at a nondescript coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, a place where the air smelled of stale beans and the booths offered the kind of deep shadows you couldn't find in the trendy spots Vanessa frequented. Trevor was an investigative journalist with the soul of a pit bull, a man who had spent his career exposing the kind of people who profited from the addiction of others while hiding behind hashtags like blessed. He was the kind of ally who understood that some battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the undeniable weight of the truth. I pushed the USB drive across the scarred wooden table, and for the next hour, the only sound was the clicking of his keys and the low hum of the refrigerator. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the spreadsheets and the internal memos Vanessa had foolishly forwarded to me over the years to prove how important she was. He told me that this went far beyond her losing her job or a simple professional reprimand. He started listing the potential fallout: federal medical fraud, systematic bribery of healthcare providers, and the suppression of safety data. He looked up at me, the reflection of the data dancing in his glasses, and said that my sister's career was effectively over the moment this hit the wire. I took a sip of my black coffee, the bitterness a welcome anchor to the cold reality of the situation. I told him that was the objective. I wanted to ensure she could never again use her corporate title or her social status to diminish the lives of others, starting with the memory of the niece she had treated as a minor inconvenience. While Trevor prepared the media strike that would target Vanessa's public image, I turned my attention to the second front of my operations: my parents. I knew that Harold Cole's greatest vulnerability wasn't a sudden pang of conscience or a realization of his own cruelty. It was his bank account and his desperate need for financial security. He took immense pride in his investment portfolio, but his understanding of modern cybersecurity was superficial at best. I didn't need to steal from them. I was a soldier, not a common thief, but I understood the power of psychological operations. I began sending a series of anonymous, highly sophisticated security alerts to my father's primary email address, designed to look identical to official communications from the IRS and his mortgage lender. The messages were brief, professional, and terrifying, warning him of suspicious activity and potential audits related to the property he had co-signed for Vanessa. I wanted to replace their unearned peace with the same frantic, suffocating panic I'd felt when I was trying to save Grace's life, while they were busy planning a barbecue. I wanted them to lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the financial foundation they had built on favoritism and neglect was finally starting to crumble beneath them. I was stripping away their comfort, layer by layer, just as they had stripped away my sense of belonging on the day of my daughter's funeral. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across my makeshift command center, a final text came through from Trevor. He confirmed that the story was locked for the morning edition and that the local FBI field office had already been briefed on the contents of the dossier. The fuse was lit, and there was no way to extinguish it now. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the apartment no longer feeling like a vacuum, but like the quiet moment before an explosion. I looked at the framed photo of Grace on my desk, her eyes bright and full of a light that my family had deemed less important than a party. I whispered an apology to her for the coldness I had to adopt, but I told her that the world needed a sense of order, and I was the one who was going to restore it. I reached over and turned off the monitors, plunging the room into a deep, absolute darkness. There was no more anxiety, no more doubt, only the steady rhythm of a plan coming to fruition. I sat in the stillness, listening to the ticking of the clock, waiting for the first light of the morning to reveal the truth to a world that had ignored us for too long. The morning of the reckoning arrived with a cold, pale light that seemed to strip away the polished veneer of the world I once knew. At exactly 7 in the morning, the digital fuse I'd lit with Trevor finally reached the powder keg. I sat in my darkened kitchen, the only light coming from the blue glow of my tablet as the front page of the state's largest news outlet refreshed. The headline was a jagged blade of truth: Black Pharma and the Party on a Grave. The unfiltered truth of sales queen Vanessa Cole. It wasn't just a dry report on corporate greed. Trevor had masterfully woven the human cost into every paragraph. The center of the article featured a split-screen image that I knew would haunt the public consciousness. On the left, Vanessa was captured in a high-definition still from her live stream, laughing and hoisting a champagne flute toward her new ceiling. On the right was the stark black-and-white obituary photo of Grace, with the timestamp of the burial highlighted in a deep, bloody red. The caption beneath it was a killing blow, noting that while a 3-year-old child was being returned to the earth, her own blood was celebrating a house bought with the kickbacks of an opioid epidemic. Within minutes, the internet didn't just notice. It exploded with a righteous, unbridled fury that no PR firm could ever hope to contain. By 9 in the morning, I was sitting in my car a block away from Vanessa's million-dollar dream home, watching the tactical execution of justice through my windshield. The quiet, manicured cul-de-sac was suddenly choked by the wail of sirens and the aggressive presence of black government SUVs. Agents from the FBI and the FDA didn't knock. They swarmed the property with a clinical efficiency that felt like home to me. I watched as Vanessa was led out onto the driveway, her $2,000 white dress a stark contrast to the cold steel of the handcuffs cinched around her wrists. Her face, which had been so carefully curated for her followers, was a smearing ruin of expensive mascara and genuine terror. She was screaming, her voice a shrill, desperate thing. But the neighbors she had worked so hard to impress were no longer looking on with envy. They were standing on their lawns, their own phones held high, recording her downfall for the very platforms she had used to humiliate me. The yellow crime scene tape was being stretched across her front door, sealing away the life she'd built on the suffering of others. Her empire didn't just fall, it vanished in the span of 2 hours. The shockwaves traveled fast, hitting the second front in Phoenix before the sun had even reached its zenith. My father's phone, which he usually used to check his golf scores, became a direct line to his own personal hell. The pharmaceutical firm, terrified of the mounting public backlash and the federal spotlight, didn't just fire Vanessa. They issued a scathing public statement and launched a retaliatory lawsuit against her and anyone associated with her financial shield. Because my father had co-signed on her mortgage and stood as a guarantor for her business ventures, the federal investigation moved through his bank accounts like a wildfire. His assets were frozen, his reputation among his elite peers evaporated instantly. And by midday, the country club he treated as a second home had quietly revoked his membership to distance themselves from the scandal. I heard later that he had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains, but even there, the cold reality of his choices met him at the door. The hospital staff, aware of the brewing federal fraud case involving his daughter, required an upfront payment that his frozen accounts could no longer provide. The final surrender came in the form of a call from an unrecognized number late that afternoon. I knew it was her before I even answered. My mother's voice was a ragged, hollowed-out ghost of the arrogant woman who had lectured me just a week ago. She was sobbing, a frantic rhythmic sound of a woman who had realized the floor had finally dropped out from under her. She begged me to help them, telling me that the authorities were taking everything and that Harold was dying in a hospital bed while the world called them monsters. She pleaded with me to call my journalist friend, to tell the world it was all a misunderstanding, to speak up for my sister because she was family. I listened to her cry, the sound of her desperation filling the small, quiet cabin of my car. But I felt nothing but a deep, absolute stillness. I didn't feel the joy I thought I would, nor did I feel the guilt she was trying so hard to manufacture. I simply waited for her to catch her breath, and when I spoke, my voice was as steady and cold as the clay I'd stood on June 15th. I told her that she was absolutely right. The living were the ones who mattered. I told her that I was living quite well, finally breathing the air of a world where the truth was no longer a secret. As for them, I told her I hoped they found the same comfort in their housewarming party that I had found at my daughter's grave. I ended the call, the silence that followed feeling like the first real peace I had known in years. The dust from the media explosion had finally begun to settle, leaving behind a landscape that was unrecognizable from the one I had grown up in. It had been several months since the FBI raid and the freezing of the Cole family assets, and the silence that followed wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I was used to. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the ceasefire had finally been signed. I spent most of my days now in a quiet rhythm of work and therapy, finally addressing the layers of trauma that had nothing to do with my time in the desert and everything to do with the people who shared my DNA. I had joined a support group for veterans, but I found myself speaking more about the betrayal at the hospital than the IEDs in Afghanistan. I was learning the hard way that while the axe forgets the blow it struck, the tree remembers every scar left in its bark. I was a tree full of scars, but I was still standing, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who decided who got to rest in my shade. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or a high-stakes meeting. It happened on the curb outside my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. I heard the rhythmic, sickly rattle of an old engine before I saw the car, a rusted, beat-up sedan that was a far cry from the sleek Mercedes my father used to wash every Sunday with such obsessive pride. The luxury cars had been repossessed, the million-dollar home was a legal crime scene, and the social standing they valued more than their own flesh and blood had evaporated overnight. When they stepped out of the vehicle, I barely recognized them. My father, Harold, looked as though he had aged 20 years in a few months, his posture slumped and his expensive suit hanging off his shrunken frame like a shroud. My mother, Janet, had lost that sharp, judgmental edge in her eyes, replaced by a frantic, hollowed-out desperation that made her look like a stranger. They stood by the curb, looking up at my window until they saw me come out onto the small porch. There were no insults today, no lectures on my negativity or demands for social media loyalty. Instead, my mother collapsed onto her knees right there on the cracked pavement, her sobs sounding like a wounded animal. She begged for my forgiveness, her voice cracking as she told me that they had made a terrible mistake and that we were family. She told me that Vanessa was facing years in federal prison, that their retirement was gone, and that I was the only thing they had left in the world. It was a performance of such profound misery that a younger version of me would have rushed down the stairs to comfort them. But the woman standing on that porch was a sergeant who had seen through far better decoys than this. As I watched her weep, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a spark of hatred. I simply felt a vast, cold emptiness. I remembered the image of Grace lying in that sterile morgue, alone because her grandparents thought a barbecue was more important than her dignity. My compassion for them had died in that cold room with my daughter, and no amount of kneeling on a sidewalk was going to bring it back. I walked down the steps, but I didn't stop to help her up. I stood several feet away, maintaining a distance that was both physical and emotional, and I handed my father a thick envelope. It wasn't a check or a letter of reconciliation. It was a formal restraining order and a cease and desist notice drafted by my attorney. I told them as calmly as I could that this was the end of the road for us. I explained that they had forfeited their right to be my parents the moment they put a price tag on their granddaughter's burial. My father tried to use the old tactics, clutching at his chest and mentioning his heart condition, telling me I couldn't possibly watch them die slowly in their old age without a hand to hold. I looked him in the eye and told him that Grace had fought stage 4 cancer with more courage and less complaining than he was showing right now. I told him to find some of that strength and to stop negotiating with a daughter he had already abandoned. The look on his face told me that the message had finally landed. They realized that the quiet, obedient girl who would do anything for a scrap of their approval was truly gone, replaced by a woman who had built her own fortress out of their neglect. I told them I didn't hate them anymore because hatred required an investment of energy that they simply weren't worth. To me, they were just strangers I used to know. Ghosts from a past life that I was finally ready to stop haunting. I turned my back on them and walked back into my apartment, ignoring the sounds of my mother's renewed wailing and the slow, pathetic retreat of their rusted car. Once the door was locked and the sound of the engine had faded into the distance, I sat down on the floor of my living room and I let myself cry. I didn't cry for the parents who were currently driving away. And I didn't cry for the sister who was awaiting her sentence. I cried for Grace, and I cried for the little girl I used to be, the one who had spent decades trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I was mourning the family I never actually had, finally accepting that the blood between us was just a biological fact, not a bond. But as the tears eventually slowed and the room went still, I felt a lightness in my chest that was entirely new. I had cleared the wreckage, I had set the boundaries, and for the first time in my life, the air I was breathing was entirely my own. I was a survivor of a war that had been fought in my own living room, and as I looked at the photograph of my daughter, I knew that the peace I had found was the only way I could truly honor her memory. The sun over the National Cemetery is warm today, a gentle and golden light that feels like a physical embrace rather than the cold, sterile glare of the hospital hallways I used to haunt. 3 years have passed since the world as I knew it ended, and yet, standing here by this small plot of land, I feel a sense of peace that I once thought was impossible for someone like me. The grass over Grace's grave is a lush, vibrant green, meticulously cared for and swaying slightly in the Virginia breeze. I kneel down and place a bouquet of sunflowers on the stone, their bright yellow petals reaching for the light. They were her favorite, a bit of sunshine she could hold in her hands even on the darkest days of her treatment. I stay there for a long time, not in a state of mourning, but in a state of quiet reflection, realizing how much the landscape of my life has shifted since I chose to walk away from the wreckage of the Cole family. My life looks very different now than it did during my decade of service. I officially hung up my uniform a year ago, deciding that my battlefield had changed. Using my savings and the settlement money from the indirect compensation involving the pharmaceutical scandal, I established the Grace's Warriors Foundation. It is a nonprofit dedicated to providing immediate financial and legal support to military families who are navigating the crushing reality of a child's terminal illness. We help with everything from mortgage payments to securing the best palliative care, ensuring that no parent ever has to stand alone in a cemetery row because they couldn't afford a plane ticket or because their family chose a party over a burial. Grace didn't die in vain. Her spirit is the foundation upon which dozens of other families are finding their footing when the earth starts to shake. Transforming my trauma into service has been the most effective medicine I have ever taken. A way to honor her memory by being the protector I wish I had back then. News from my former life reaches me in fragments, like static on a distant radio. I heard recently that Vanessa was released early from her sentence for good behavior, but the legal system ensured she will never again hold a position of trust in the medical or sales industry. She is reportedly working as a cashier at a discount grocery store in a town where no one knows her name, living in a cramped, anonymous apartment that is a far cry from the 5-bedroom dream home she built on the suffering of others. My parents are still in Oklahoma, living out their days on a meager pension, their social circles having evaporated the moment the truth hit the front page. Occasionally, I feel a sharp, familiar twinge in my chest when I think of them, but it is the dull ache of an old scar reacting to a change in the weather rather than a fresh wound that is still bleeding. I don't carry hatred for them anymore because hatred is an active, exhausting investment that I am no longer willing to make. I have realized that the ultimate form of revenge isn't a lawsuit or a scandal. It is the absolute indifference of a life well lived without them. Auntie Ellie. The high-pitched, joyful shout breaks my reverie, and I turn to see Julia's young son sprinting across the grass toward me. He collides with my legs, his laughter a pure and uncomplicated sound that fills the quiet air. Julia and David are walking a few paces behind him, their faces relaxed and wearing the kind of smiles that come from a deep, shared history of survival. We spend most of our weekends together now, whether it is hiking through the Blue Ridge Mountains or hosting noisy barbecues in my backyard. David has remarried, and his wife has become one of my closest confidants, a woman who understands that family isn't something you are born into, but something you build with the people who stay when everyone else leaves. We are a strange, beautiful, patchwork family, stitched together by the superglue of genuine affection and the shared knowledge that we are each other's chosen kin. I stand up and brush the blades of grass from my knees, looking up at the vast, infinite blue of the afternoon sky. I can almost feel Grace's presence in the warmth of the sun on my face, a silent confirmation that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm no longer the broken victim of the Cole family's narcissism or a casualty of their neglect. I'm Sergeant Ellie Cole, mother to a hero, and a guardian for those who are still fighting their own wars in the dark. I have walked through the deepest valley of the shadow of death, and I have finally found the path leading out into the light. I am okay now, baby girl, I whisper into the wind, feeling a sense of closure that is as solid as the ground beneath my feet. The mission of survival's over, the mission of revenge is complete, and the mission of simply being happy is beginning right now. Ellie's story serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is not a variable to be determined by the people who are incapable of valuing you. We are often taught that family is an unconditional bond, but the truth is that blood only makes you related. It is loyalty, presence, and respect that make you family. Resilience isn't just about surviving a tragedy like the loss of a child or the betrayal of a sister. It is about the quiet, radical act of deciding that the wreckage will not be your final destination. When you set a boundary with toxic people, you aren't losing them, you are finally choosing yourself. True healing begins the moment you stop seeking permission to be happy from the very people who benefited from your silence. I want to sincerely thank you for walking this difficult path with me and Ellie. Stories like hers are mirrors of the silent battles many of you fight every single day in your own living rooms. If Ellie's strength moved you, or if you found your own chosen family in the wake of a storm, I would love to hear your reflections. Have you ever had to find the courage to stand alone to protect your peace? Please share your thoughts or even just a word of encouragement in the comments below. Your voice is the heartbeat of this community. If this journey touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to know they aren't alone. Like and follow to stay with us for more stories of restoration and strength.